So, a while back I made a video on how to take models from Google SketchUp and import them into Second Life. It was a very poorly done video, and a lot has changed since I made that video. Notably, Mesh has gone live on the main grid. Second Life has changed the way the Mesh uploader works with the viewer, and I've learned a tremendous amount about SketchUp, specifically how SketchUp handles geometry and how that can cause problems for people wishing to import their models into Second Life. So this video is kind of an updated version that hopefully will explain and clarify everything that was basically missed in the first video. So this model is basically the same model that was used in the original video. The only difference is I've added some letters here to make the geometry a little more complicated so that I can explain the various issues that SketchUp has and how that affects importing models into Second Life. Now, I think the most crucial thing to understand is that basically SketchUp is not really designed to be a program where you create models and then export them to other platforms. It's really sort of designed to do its own thing as best as possible, which is why it's so great for building. But naturally, you want to export your models at some point if you want to do anything with them outside of SketchUp. So what exactly does this mean? Well, it means that we can't really rely entirely on SketchUp to give us the model that we want to import, and that's unfortunate, but there are also some advantages. But basically it requires post-processing, and that requires a couple of things, at least in my tool set, and that is first a plugin called Triangulate Faces, which can be downloaded. I will put the necessary info in the description for that, and a free, more advanced 3D modeling program called Blender, which will allow you to sort of refine your model. So I'm the kind of person who believes that just telling people to do things without really explaining why they should do them is kind of ridiculous. So I'm just gonna, to the best of my ability, try to go over the reasoning behind why you'll want to do what I'm about to demonstrate. Basically, if you were to just export this model right now as a COLLADA file, what you would have is not a single mesh, even though this in SketchUp is a single object. When it actually exports as multiple meshes, and those are effectively random. I mean, they're not random, but this could be a separate mesh. You know, this little box here could be a separate mesh. Anyway, the model that you export could literally be made up of dozens of meshes overlapping, and that's a problem because, for example, if you have this face here, which is made up of several polygons, and then this face here, which is made up of polygons, the line that they share here, where they're intersecting, may actually be overlapped by another line, and that can cause a lot of problems later on, in addition to making your model unnecessarily complex. And I'm sorry if this is a poor explanation, but it's a really kind of a complicated thing to grasp, although it will be a lot clearer in a moment when I triangulate this model. However, the important thing to remember is that what we really want, ideally, is a model that is optimized. That is sort of the goal of all of this post-processing. But before we can move on to the post-processing, we actually have to triangulate this model. So first what I'm going to do is select the entire model, and then I'm going to go to Plugins and Triangulate Faces. And now what that will do is take my SketchUp model and convert it into polygons, effectively triangulating all the geometry. So this is how 3D models are actually made, is with all these little triangles. And those polygons basically constitute the faces that make up the geometry. Alright, so now that the model is accurately triangulated, we can export it safely. So I'm going to just go to Export 3D Model, and now this is absolutely crucial. This is just as important as the triangulation. You have to go into the options down here and make sure that this particular option, Triangulate All Faces, is not checked. Because if that's checked, then what SketchUp will do is completely ruin all of this triangulation here and create its fake triangulation that doesn't really work because it's several meshes, while this triangulation is basically of a unified mesh. So I find that just having all these unchecked is fine for Second Life. I mean, none of these are really important, and all of them are just going to add additional complexity to the model. And what we're really trying to do is export the absolute minimum geometry. So that's unchecked. Now I'm just going to export this, and there we go. So now basically we're done with SketchUp. Alright, so now we're in Blender, and Blender's free. It's a really powerful program. It has its quirks, but overall it's a very nice piece of software. So the first thing we're going to do is import our model. So I'm going to go to File, Import, COLLADA, and I'm going to find that file I exported from SketchUp and go to Import. And there it is. Alright, so now we have our model in Blender, and you don't really even have to learn any of the controls of Blender unless you really want to, as long as you know your model that you've imported is basically already okay, which we do because we were just looking at it in SketchUp. So the next step here, what we're going to want to do, since we're in object mode, that's just like the overview kind of mode, I'm going to go to select all by type and mesh. So that will select all the meshes in your model if there are multiples, which there are not here, but that's kind of irrelevant for the time being. But I think that's a reliable method to select all the meshes. And then what that allows you to do is click on object mode and go into edit mode here. And once you're into edit mode, this looks familiar, you can see basically the same thing we were looking at in SketchUp, where this is the actual geometry. So in order to select the whole model, you hit the A key, and then what you want to do is your post-processing, which is basically remove doubles. And it removed 1,772 vertices. And what that means basically is that there were places where there was more than one of these little points, these nexuses, if you will, where all of the polygon edges come together. And when you remove doubles, basically what you do is you eliminate all of those duplicate vertices, duplicate edges, and they're all merged into the least number of points required to form the polygons that constitute the model. And the second step in the post-processing, I'm going to hit A again. I have to hit it twice because I already had a point selected, but basically you can just select all again and then go to Recalculate. This is under the Normals heading. And what that means is it takes all these little points and it flips them in a consistent direction so that, well, I mean, that's what it does. I mean, there isn't really any sort of scientific explanation for why that matters, but suffice it to say, it's best to have them all pointing in the same direction. And that's all there is to the post-processing. Pretty easy, right? So now we just go down to Export, COLLADA, and we're done with Blender. We can move on to Second Life. Alright, so here we are in Second Life, and there's actually quite a bit to this next step. Obviously you go to Build, Upload, Model, and then you find the model that we just exported from Blender. Go to Open, and now here's where things get a bit tricky. Here's the model in the preview window, and there's a lot of options here, obviously. I found that a good way to sort of start out is just to immediately go to Calculate Weights and Fees. And as you can see down here, this is the important number, the prim equivalency, and then the upload fee. And these numbers are useful because they just give you the basic idea of the absolute minimum in terms of cost and footprint before you mess with any of the other options. One cool thing to note here that a lot of people surprisingly don't know about is that this preview window is actually just like a regular Second Life window, so you can use the camera controls that you would use in Second Life to view your model in detail, and basically you can check to make sure that everything is ship shape. So there's a tremendous amount of options here. I think most people would probably be intimidated, even with a bit of technical background. It still is kind of confusing. But what we want really is the optimal outcome. So what is really the most important thing to note? And first of all, level of detail is just basically how the model looks at different distances, and it's pretty obvious if you just flip through these, like what's going on. And I have found that most of the time it seems like auto-generate does the trick, and I really don't understand the necessity of the load for file unless you wanted to micromanage every little detail of your model. And so I would recommend just sticking with auto-generate. And another thing that's nice about that is when you go over to physics, you can just select use level of detail. So what that does is it uses the auto-generated LOD from the first tab for the physics. When it comes to physics, you can actually get away with not even messing with the physics or even using a physics layer. It's only necessary if you want your object to be physical or also to be interacted with physically. In other words, in terms of avatars collision. Like this is an arch. I want to be able to walk between the two columns on either side. And the only way I can do that is if there's physics information associated with the model. So for this model, it doesn't look like the lowest level of detail is going to cut it, although if you click on Analyze, it can give you a little bit better idea of how the physics is going to work. Basically, the colored region is sort of the solid region, and the non-colored region is the sort of phantom region. So for example, if my avatar was trying to walk through this arch, as it is pictured here, he could actually walk through this part of the column, but his head would bang against the purple and the blue. So we want to use a higher level of detail for the physics. So what I'm going to do is just start at the bottom naturally and work my way up. And each time I go to a new level of detail, I'm going to click this Analyze again, and that gives me a little clearer picture of where my physical regions are. I'm kind of a perfectionist when it comes to the physics layer. I like it to be really accurate, so I'm gonna go to medium, analyze that again. Now this is pretty close. I mean, this is almost good enough, but like I said, I'm a perfectionist, so I'm gonna go to high, and finally I get the physics that I really want, which is basically I want these columns to have full physics. So in other words, if my avatar was to walk up on that little edge there, he would actually move up and would not just pass through it like it was a phantom object. So this is a good looking physics shape for me. Once again, there are a lot of like fine-tuning options within here, but Linden Labs actually did a really great job of organizing this so that basically the default options usually give you really good results. In fact, I found them to be optimal probably 90% of the time. So on to step 2. This simplification isn't really necessary, but it can sometimes lower your costs a little. So I usually give it a try just to see what happens. And see, that was a disaster right there. So I really didn't want to simplify, because now my physics shape basically completely destroys the arch. So I go back up to analyze and click that again, and I have my nice clean physics shape. So I'm going to just leave it like this, and everything looks good. So I'm going to calculate fees again. And so I'm going to be paying 32 lindens, and it's 1.8, so it's going to be 2 prim equivs because they like to round up. As for modifiers, these are kind of useless unless you're working on something a lot more advanced than this, what I'm doing right here. So I'm not even going to cover that. This is really just a basic tutorial, and it's not going to get into that advanced stuff. So I'm ready to go. Now normally the thing is that I just want to point out here, as I said, this is a basic tutorial. I would not upload this model right now, not because it isn't perfect, but because there's no UV map, and so texturing it really would be challenging, given that Second Life's built-in texturing tools are very limited. So I wouldn't normally upload, but I'm going to upload this just for the sake of the demonstration. Alright, so there's my mesh successfully uploaded. I'm going to rename it, and then I'm going to res it. And there it is, exactly how it's supposed to be, exactly how it looked in SketchUp and Blender. Now, as a lot of people noticed from the original video, my avatar wasn't actually able to walk through the arch. And as you'll note here, that is once again true. And that's because when you first res a mesh, it doesn't have the physics shape enabled for some reason. And that is accessed by going to Features, and then Physics Shape Type. You change this from Convex Hull to Prim. I don't know why it's titled that way, but it is. So that's what you have to set it to. And once that's done, then the physics shape is fully enabled, and look at that, my avatar can walk right through there. How exciting. So yeah, that's how to take a mesh created in SketchUp and post-process it and successfully upload it to Second Life. And that is with physics enabled and everything else. So this video is a lot more advanced and comprehensive than my original, and I hope you find it just as useful as it's intended to be. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching.